Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament here again. I know I have not been doing regular content recently. I don't know if it's probably like a month since my last video, been probably a few months since my last stream. Sorry for the drought in content recently, but I could not allow today to go unremarked upon, so I decided to put together this little Dominion Day special for all the non-Canadians present, or for all the Canadians who aren't steeped enough um, in autistic internet Canadian circles to know what Dominion Day is. That is, of course, the original name for Canada Day, um, which for non-Canadians, that's Canada's national holiday. It was changed by Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1980 to Canada Day. So that's what we're trying to mark today, and to do that, we're going to be doing a book review of a very famous book in Canadian history called Lament for a Nation. I'll introduce that a little bit later. But there's a few controversies I want to settle first. Now, first, there's some liars out there who might claim that the original thumbnail for this video had a very egregious typo on it. And I just wanted to say that that is a lie. That's false. There were no typos on the original thumbnail for this video, and anyone spreading lies like that are trying to libel and slander the channel. I will sue you if I find out who you are. Two, I'd like to say that the fault for that typo rests entirely in Cringewalker. I don't know how I could allow Cringewalker to be my minion, and allow him such a prominent spot on this channel, allowing him to create all my thumbnails out of the generosity of my heart. I know I can make much better thumbnails, but I allow Cringewalker to do it, and he messes it up that much to have such a blatant, disgusting typo, and not only such a blatant, disgusting typo, but on today of all days, Dominion Day. So I would just like to say that that Cringewalker is fired. He will no longer be making thumbnails for me. So you can rest assured that all the beautiful thumbnails you'll see in the future are solely made by me and no one else. So that, I mean, that's all really the preamble. Today, like I said, we'll be talking about Lament for a Nation, written by George Grant, a Canadian conservative philosopher from the mid 20th century. He was one of the last figures in sort of old school Canadian conservatism. I'm sure we'll go over this stuff more in more detail as we continue to talk about this. But basically, more traditional forms of Canadian conservatism was more skeptical of things like free markets, and especially was more skeptical of America, where really for the first century of Canada, from Confederation, that is. Of course, Canada existed before Confederation, but of the modern Canadian state, the right tended to be anti-American, and the left tended, or the center-left, the liberals, tended to be pro-American. And even for much of that time, progressives tended to be pro-American. George Grant was sort of one of the final figures representing that classical Canadian conservatism. And with the defeat of John Diefenbaker in 1963, which was fought specifically on issues relating to pro and anti-Americanism, Grant viewed that as sort of the final defeat of Canadian nationalism, meaning that there was no real hope for a truly independent Canadian nation to continue to exist in the future. And that's what the book Lament for a Nation is about. It's a fairly short essay. I think it's, depending on your copy, it's only like 70 or 80 pages long, maybe 100. In the newer versions they have of it, they have an introduction that is as long as the book. So it's quite long. It's a very important book in Canadian right-wing circles. I would definitely highly recommend anyone watching, especially Canadians, but even non-Canadians. I think there's some interesting things to be learned, even if you're not Canadian. But we'll be talking about this book in a bit in more detail for the rest of the stream. But that's just the basic overview. Is there anyone here that would like to get started with anything on this now that I've given that basic overview?
I wouldn't mind. So I think with Lament for a Nation, am I heard? Is my mic working?
Yeah.
Okay. With Lament for a Nation, I think certainly a very prescient kind of political opinion for its time, and I think it holds up quite well, particularly with a lot of the critiques of liberalism. However, and perhaps this is Cope being a 21st century Canadian nationalist, but I do think some of the prescriptions he draws are perhaps too harsh, and I can understand because he came from that kind of early 20th, late 19th century Canada, where there was a very strong sense of British loyalty, where there was a very concrete sense of what Canada meant, a very strong rejection of the Americanisms that now engulf our culture. And I think the society that he came from was certainly a different country than the one we live in today. I would not, however, um, have such a pessimistic view as he did, and I think this is the main place where I disagree with him on. And perhaps if he was still alive today, he would have a similar one. But I do think there is still hope for Canadian nationalism, and the not only the nation of Canada, which I think when people say that they're referring to kind of Anglo Canada from, say, Ontario to rural British Columbia, but more specifically the state, the polity of Canada, which is I would say personally not a nation but a confederation of nations that are unified in the interest of opposing kind of a foreign imposition. So that's where I would differ from George Grant's kind of overarching thesis within Lament for a Nation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I you know, sorry, I meant to start with this. I don't really feel like I need to introduce everyone here, especially since two of you guys are sort of Twitter randos who don't really have anything to promote. But I did want to introduce the Canadian Journal, especially since I know if I do it at the beginning, that's more likely that you'll actually get more followers. I do really appreciate the stuff you do. For those of you in the audience who are unaware, the Canadian Journal is a relatively small still right wing online journal promoting these types of ideas. It's linked in the description. I'd highly recommend anyone watching, especially Canadians, to check it out. Is there anything you'd like to say about the Canadian Journal before we
Oh
progress on
yeah,
our stuff?
thank you very much for having us on. It's always appreciated. Um, but yeah, so the Canadian Journal is an incorporated kind of editorial magazine of sorts. Um, we started it in university, a group of friends, where we were very tired of everyone talking about politics and about Canada in the context of America, and we actually believe that this country exists and that this country is particular and unique and distinct and is actually real. So we wanted to talk about it, and that's what we at least tried to do. We created the website, we incorporated, we did all these things to provide people a place to talk about Canada. And again, that's what Settler is doing today by giving us this platform. So yeah, just we're interested in the promotion of Canadian ideas and discussion in really in any form from any ideology, because Canada exists.
Yeah, totally. That is so on what you said previously, how justified was George Grant's pessimism? And I know that he of course always rejected the label pessimist, but that's because mostly he was working with a very specific philosophical definition of what pessimism means. Um, but I don't know. I feel like I constantly go back and forth on this. I certainly today do not, um, on this, what is it? Is it 155th anniversary of Confederation this year? Um,
But there's 1857, right?
yeah,
So it'll be 155, yeah.
yeah. On this 155th anniversary of the modern Canadian state, I'm not feeling very optimistic. Um, and and I sort of feel like with that said, that to a lot of people looking back, it seems absurd to have pronounced Canada an essentially dead nation in the 1960s of all times. That yes, of course, the British Empire was falling apart rapidly. What Canada traditionally was disappearing. But I feel like a lot of people think it seems a bit absurd. At least unless you look at it from the current year and realize how and what a bad place Canada is currently. Um, but yeah, I know I struggle to find reasons exactly for optimism about the future of Canada. It seems to me like American integration is just progressing more and more, and that any attempts for continued cultural autonomy of Canada, um, all that really means is having a more and more fervent left-wing social agenda. So what is it, Ryan, that makes you optimistic about the continued existence of Canada?
I suppose this might make me a bit of a pariah, but I think we need to understand Canada in its historical context. Um, I don't think that George Grant's prescription of Canada as a nation that has died is necessarily wrong. But I also wouldn't say it is necessarily right, which is one of the great frustrations of academia, is this eternal kind of fiddling over the middle ground and having an uncriticizable centrist position. Um, the Canada that my grandfather grew up in, fought for, and built, the Canada my father grew up in and built, these are totally alien to modern Canada, and I think we can all agree on that. Our country now is very different. Now, does that mean that Canada, as both a nation and as a polity that exists for a particular reason, are dead, irrelevant, and consigned to the dustbin of history? I personally would not say so. I would say that the particular and almost medieval constitution of Canada, and I say constitution in the manner of structure, is incredibly important, more so now than ever before. Um, but there is still the looming threat of not only American assimilation, but assimilation kind of writ large by the empires that surround us, because we must remember that there is massive Chinese influence in Canada, and there's significant, well, not significant Russian influence, but the Russians do share a border with us along the Northwest Passage, which is going to become a geopolitical concern in the near future. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular discussion. So yes, I do think that Grant had grounds for pessimism, and I think as a public intellectual, it's not necessarily wrong for him to take that position. But I'm a young man in the 21st century, and I'm interested in preserving both the polity of Canada in its kind of complete confederated state. This is why I oppose secessionism, and I'm interested in kind of preserving the varied, and there are multiple different nations within Canada, but the particular ways of life of each of these groups. Now, obviously, I live in Ontario, so I belong to a particular tradition within Canada that kind of grew up playing hockey, cottage life kind of way of life that is innate to a lot of English speaking Canada. And to me, at least, I've watched that life, that particular way of life, degrade and decline over the course of my lifetime, over the last 10, 15 years. Now, that is not to say that it is dead, but it is certainly under attack. Um, Now, I think where I might differ from a lot of kind of esoteric leaf Twitter and political commentators nowadays is I am obviously I oppose Americanism. I think that America has proven to be, and this is something that Grant noted as well, when he said that America is the orgasm at home, the napalm abroad. America is a fundamentally liberalizing imperium. It is the acid that dissolves particularity, that dissolves that which is distinct, and creates this kind of global market that is the same everywhere. New York is indistinguishable from Toronto, is indistinguishable from London, so on and so forth. We've all heard these arguments ad nauseum, but I don't think that this process is continuing. Now, I would argue that in contrast to Grant, who was writing at the peak of American empire, when America was conquering the world, and slightly before Francis Fukuyama wrote his kind of infamous book on the kind of the victory of the liberal order. But I think we're watching American empire in recession. We're watching them recede from a lot of their colonial garrisons on the far-flung Middle East. We're watching them kind of demand that their once subservient political clients in Europe take on a greater share. And we need to remember that the American liberal order is built upon their guarantee of security and wealth and prosperity for their clients in exchange for buying into the American political, social, and economic order. These things are cracking at the seams, and America is in recession. And I think that continued American assimilation of Canada is not going to be much of a problem going forwards. I think in terms of explicit annexation, that will never happen. The political capital that would be required is insanely high, and there's no benefit as things are right now, because of how integrated Canada's economy already is with the Americans. Now, if we want to go into Donald Crichton, I believe, is the writer. I have his book behind me somewhere. Yes. So Donald Crichton, famous Canadian historian. Admittedly, he is of the Whig tradition, but I don't think that's necessarily condemnation. He discusses the distinction between Canada and America economically, where Canada developed out of the East-West system, where Canada, coming out of the St. Laurent, was always moving east to west, whereas America in the initial colonial days, which was constrained by the Appalachian Mountains, was a north-south system. And Donald Crichton argues that, or not Donald, I mean Donald Crichton and later on, Grant, both have the similar position that Canada is annexed into the North-South economic zone, which is understandable. That is the global behemoth, the economic giant, the imperial titan of our age. But it is worth distinguishing this. Canada has been absorbed in large part into at least the American economic system, and that has large ramifications for our politics and for our culture. So yeah, that's kind of the broad understanding of Canadian politics and economics in the 21st century, at least as I understand it from my reading. Might not be perfect, but that's what I have it as. Now, what does that mean for the future of Canada? I think if we're realistic about how geopolitics are going to pan out, America is going to continue to remain strong. America, I don't think, is going to disappear overnight, despite what a lot of kind of apocalyptic hopefuls will think. I think America has a great deal of internal resources and doesn't really need a lot from its outside, which is why the knife fight over controlling the imperial heartland is getting so vicious now. Is kind of whoever controls America controls the world. But we have the unfortunate geopolitical reality of being on the border of the largest and strongest empire in human history. And what does that mean for us, and how do we navigate that? So the 21st and 22nd century for Canada will be a huge challenge, but I don't think that in light of America's kind of looking inwards, we will be quite as annexed as America, as an American client, viceroyalty, whatever you want to call it, an American province in 1980s, for example. There is a distinction between that period and now. And I think if Canada is led well, and if Canada is governed properly, in full knowledge of what Canada is in its uniqueness and particularity, then I think Canadian identity can be not only preserved, but asserted. I think the idea as conservatives or as right-wing people, I don't necessarily call myself a conservative, that we should simply fight an ailing rearguard against the kind of the ever-marching iron boot of progress is something that really damages how we conceive ourselves unconsciously and consciously. I think we should, and the Supreme Court case in the Americas is certainly a wonderful example of this, but we should be looking to assert ourselves and impose ourselves upon the political world as much as we can, rather than being content just to kind of take the scraps and the institutions that are left to us because they're of so little use to those who currently wield power. Sorry for the perhaps schizophrenic monologue, but these are the kind of foundational elements that I think are important to understand when discussing Canada.
No, I think that was all very interesting. I'd agree with a lot of what you said. Just to clarify from what I had said earlier, I don't believe that Canada is a dead nation. All I was saying is I understand why you could come to that conclusion. I wouldn't necessarily say we're far off from there. But I'm not willing. Perhaps it's just a little bit of optimism left in me that I'm unwilling to concede that Canada is an entirely dead nation. But I don't really want to continue to go on. We have 3 other guests here that haven't really talked at all yet. Is there anyone that would like to respond to anything that's been said thus far?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Dobbs case in the U.S. because that's an important part of Grant's story too, right? Like towards the end of his career was when Morgentaler happened in Canada, and you read in English-speaking justice and technology and justice too. He identifies that as sort of like the core contradiction in liberalism, in that you're removing someone from having human rights within human rights law. Something like that. It's been a while. So I think in that sense, number one, even despite being black-pilled, Grant was still believe there was something worth fighting for. But number two, he can be a model for us. It is a little outside the scope of the book, but like I said, I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, so that sort of brings me to something I was planning on getting to at some point. This is a bit sooner than I was, but I don't know, I feel like it kind of fits in here. And just a question I'd like to pose to everyone in general, especially the Canadians, because there's unfortunately an American in our midst.
I guess.
So as I briefly said earlier, in Canadian history until the post-war period, the Conservatives were generally associated with anti-Americanism, and the Liberals were generally associated with pro-Americanism. And those sentiments, those were not just sort of arbitrary sentiments. It is because the United States was viewed as the sort of center of progress. So if you were a liberal or progressive person, you would naturally support that center of progress. And if you were against that supposed social progress, then you would oppose it. I've read a book on this very topic recently, which was the author is obviously a liberal, but it was still an interesting book. It was called Pride and Prejudice. I think it was a history of intellectual anti-Americanism in Canada from 1891 to 1945. And one analogy he gives in the book is that the United States was essentially viewed as an ideological state in the same sense of, say, the Soviet Union. That is most.
That's
states,
actually a fair comparison, I would say.
yeah, and it's not
Especially
like I'm not saying
just Enlightenment, New World Enlightenment nations in general.
yeah, and
tend to be ideological
to
state. Yeah.
To be clear, it's not obviously the United States. I mean, the United States has done a lot of bad things, but obviously the United States didn't like martyr priests the way that the Soviet Union did. No one's claiming that they did. No one's claiming that any president in the U.S. is identical to Stalin. And I'm sure the author certainly wasn't saying that. He was just trying to describe how people saw it, not in the sense of saying that it had the same sort of totalitarianism. Obviously, it didn't.
I mean, we've had a couple near dictators, but not nowhere near to Stalin.
Yeah, but no. So in the sense of being an expressly ideological state, where most states grow out of some sort of traditional linguistic or ethnic group, or have something to do with religious affiliations or stuff like that. None of that is really how America was created. America was created on specifically ideological grounds. So that is why people that were opposed to Enlightenment values, or at least skeptical of them, would have been anti-American. People who were supportive of them would have been pro-American. But like I said, there's a question I was trying to get to at this. This is just mostly an explanation for the audience, because I imagine a lot of people probably aren't very familiar with this, and a lot of viewers probably aren't even Canadian. But the question I want to pose is, if historic Canadian anti-Americanism was sort of instrumental in character, if it was because America is progressive, therefore we must be anti-American, then I feel like the question a lot of sort of normie Canadian conservatives would ask to anyone talking about this is why would we want to be anti-American today? Isn't it obvious that America is more conservative than Canada today? Especially with just 1 week ago, Roe v. Wade being overturned. In that case, doesn't it kind of seem anachronistic to be doesn't it kind of seem anachronistic to be concerned with anti-Americanism when it doesn't really seem like America is it doesn't really seem like America is the center of progress anymore.
I mean, I just want to say, in the United States at least, and this has especially been the case in the ever since Trudeau Jr. has been prime minister. But in the United States, generally, we've always seen Canada as being more "quote unquote" progressive than us, if that makes sense. Like, at least that's kind of
I mean, certainly, certainly that is contemporary Canadian left-wing nationalism is explicitly based on being more progressive than America.
Yeah, I mean, because that is also the because whatever sort of picture they've managed to paint Canada as being like that, that's how we see it over here. That's how we perceive you guys here in the U.S. as well.
But would anyone like to answer the question I posed?
Well, so when it comes to, I mean, I guess, whether America is no longer the center of progress because they've had some recent changes to their policy to make things more "quote unquote" conservative in an obviously an admirable way. I don't know. I just feel like saying that they're no longer the head of progress, I feel like that's not an accurate description of the change that's happened, because there's still, I mean, in Lament for a Nation, a case that's made for America being sort of the lead progressive nation is their movement towards sort of absolute homogeneity, and sort of the Anglo-Saxonist Americanization of cultures in North America. That has not ended at all. If anything, I would say that has continued to ramp up as much as possible. Even even as they've embraced quote unquote multiculturalism, that Canada would absolutely still lose in a situation where we decided to just sort of go as hard as we wanted into aligning with the United States.
I actually do want to contest the idea that, and certainly like metropolitan Canada is extremely bohemian, very liberal. I'm not going to pretend that it's not. I do think that by virtue of the particular structure of Canadian politics, and the fact that we have explicit recognition of nations within nations and the power that Quebec has within kind of our political process, kind of being the spoiler a lot of the time. Canada actually, statistically, and this is something that's pretty well understood within political science, is more anti-immigration than the Americans are, which seems surprising. The issue, however, is that you can't build a populist base because you need Quebec. And Quebec has for a long time been at odds with the Conservatives, who base themselves out of Alberta. And I think this has been one of the big spoilers with Canadian right-wing politics in the 20th century, particularly, is the Conservatives alienated Quebec in the early 20th century with kind of the conscription issues and so on. And they kind of briefly appealed to them, at least were able to get their votes with Diefenbaker. But I think they've really struggled to get the Quebecois back to where they had them with the pre-Borden conscription crisis with Johnny MacDonald, where he had real Quebecois clients that were really like winning Quebec ridings of their own accord within that province. And I think in the absence of the Conservatives, like bringing Quebec back within the fold, there is a really difficult time constructing a conservative political movement in Canada.
My question, I have a question though. So for this sort of, I guess, going based off of what Grant's vision more or less is of the idea of a Canadian unity or Canadian nation, how importantly does Quebec play into that? Because I know a lot of them want to be a nation of their own. Like there's a large nationalist movement there. Are they an essential part of? Okay.
I mean, I would say like Quebec is a nation. Like Quebec is literally a nation if we understand it in the original term of nation, like deriving from ethnos in the Bible, or natio from the old Latin, I believe. I think my linguistics might be a little bit off in that case. But if we are to understand nation, it is a particular heritage and geographical like collection of people. It is not simply like a synonym for the state. I think we should operate under that assumption. But Quebec currently is explicitly, well, I don't know if I don't think it has special nation status yet in de jure fashion. I think that was Brian Mulroney's attempt in the 90s, but kind of failed. But I think everyone recognized that
didn't Harper, pass some sort of law recognizing, I don't think there was anything practical connected to it, but it, like officially recognized Quebec as a distinct nation?
Maybe. But I think if we look at the practice of Canadian politics, Quebec is like, it's not only is it its own nation in a similar way that the kind of Métis or like the Pléon or the Acadiens are particular nations within Canada that have kind of explicit recognition, but it's has its own degree of political autonomy, which it has negotiated with the central government, which is why Canada is so interesting politically, because it has essentially a medieval structure where you're negotiating a particular political contract, social contract with the sovereign, and then operating with relative autonomy in kind of subservience and constant tension with that sovereign, which is why it's very interesting. But I think in the absence of Quebec, Anglo-Canada would have probably been assimilated totally into the American paradigm. I think that's the reality of it. And I think having to deal with the Quebecois allowed Anglo-Canada to conceive of itself as loyalist, as Protestant, whatever you want to conceive of itself as, which I think is a big part of why Canada had the really strong Orangeman movement, so on and so forth. Like without Quebec, we would have had a much harder time conceiving of ourselves as something distinct because we wouldn't have had that foreign entity present. And I think going forward, Quebec is very important to the cohesion of Canada. Now, I don't think there will ever be a single Canadian nation, quote unquote, where the Quebecois just become the same as Anglo-Canada. And personally, I would oppose that. But I think in keeping the confederation, the polity, the particular like political institution of Canada together, Quebec is very important. And I think that particular political institution is really important to guaranteeing each of the particular nations within Canada the continued existence of their particular way of life. And like it is only together that we are able to oppose external forces, I suppose is the case that I would make.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what you said there. I mean, just when it comes to practical politics, if you care about a practical political movement, Quebec is clearly just necessary because they're a quarter of the country. It's, I mean, like, say, for Americans, you might think, well, there's really big states that are like that we can just write off from a conservative standpoint. Like, you can just write off California. But California, yeah, it's really big, but it's only about, I think, 10% of the U.S.'s population.
I think a little over or a little under, but around there, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you can create an effective political movement in the United States that does not require you to win elections in California. You just can't do the same thing in Canada because of how big of a faction of Canada Quebec is. You're going to be losing a lot of elections, and conservatives. Not even that I'm a big fan of the Conservatives since the 1960s, really. But still, that this has been, as Ryan said, a continual problem for the Canadian Conservatives, that they have not had much success in Quebec. But yeah, so and also Quebec, at least before the Silent Revolution, always injected a bit more of a religious and cultural dimension to, especially religious, to Canadian distinctiveness. Especially since I believe most of us here are Catholic. Politicrat, I know you're not, but most of the people here are Catholic. And of course, historically, at least, the majority of a very strong majority of Anglo Canadians were Protestant. So that meant in practical terms that the distinguishing factor between between Anglo Canadians and Americans was not really a religious factor. No, that's not to say there were no differences. I imagine sort of more conservative Anglicans might have really looked on Americans with disdain with stuff like the Restorationist movements. But still, generally speaking, generally speaking, the religious factor was not the main differentiating force.
I think it would be more of a driving wedge between them, or both of them, and the Quebecois.
Yeah. So I do think there are certain positive elements that are it just, I mean, as Ryan said, I do think Quebec culture is unique and good, and that it's for that reason alone it deserves to continue to exist. But I do think there are certain things that, at least historically, it injected into the national consciousness that was quite good for Canada. And just to answer my own question a bit, to be clear, I don't want to say that with what I was saying previously that I agree with the question I was posing. I don't. I just think it's an interesting question, especially something that I find I don't get phrased in exactly that way, but from a lot of normie Canadian conservatives nowadays, that's, if I try to talk to them about Lament for a Nation or Anti-americanism or something like that, they're probably going to have a response similar to what I expressed, where they're just going to think like America got gay marriage like a decade after we did. America, abortion is illegal in some states now. America actually has a movement pushing back against socially progressive things, where, like, the Conservative Party here voted for the voted for the bill that this year that that was, according to the government, supposed to ban what's the term, conversion therapy. That's a completely dishonest term. It has nothing to do with what they're saying it does. But so it does. The immigration point is well taken. But still, even there, even if Canadians are more anti-immigration, it's clear that there's more of a practical political movement that's anti-immigration in the United States. So I understand why Canadians would bring that up if in opposition to any form of anti-Americanism. With that said, I feel like it totally misses the point of Canadian anti-Americanism. The point is not to say that America is on average more liberal, therefore America needs to be opposed. It's not saying that like if you poll Americans, you find that they're more liberal. The issue is we know where where left-wing ideas come from. We know that they generally come from American universities, and that's where they're spread from throughout the world. We're not saying that that it's like hillbillies in Texas or something that are spreading these ideas. What we're saying is that there's a particular ideological group in the United States and in other countries too. I'm not saying that ideological progressivism is unique to the United States, but for the most part, its origin point is usually the United States, and that's really what. That is a big part of what we're trying to criticize when we talk about anti-Americanism. It really the issue of whether or not the United States is on average more conservative, or whether or not they have a more effective conservative movement currently. Really, it's kind of missing the point, and that is why I find just in real life why it's difficult to talk to people about this, because it's hard for them to really get what I'm trying to say. But yeah, does anyone have anything?
I actually did want to respond to a few things. So there was a question in chat recently, which I think has expired, from this Pete Budapest fellow, who talks about how Canada is pretty clearly marching under the banner of...
that's a super chat, so I'll just read out the whole thing. Pete Budapest for $10. It would appear to me that Canadians and other G7 nations have signaled their anti-Americanism by adopting a style of liberalism that is not anti-American, but rather hyper-American.
Yeah, I read that. That is a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah. Yes. No. It. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this author, but I've talked about him on my channel many times before. Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, described it as counter-Americanism being the conservative form of anti-Americanism, and ultra-Americanism as the progressive form, where they might seem like similar things sometimes, but counter-Americanism is opposing the certain Enlightenment values and American ideology, where hyper-Americanism is just a more aggressive form of American ideology.
So to respond to what he's saying here, I think it's important that we conceive of Canada in a few ways and understand some things about Canadian history. Now, abortion in Canada is actually a really irritating topic. Not irritating. It's a very depressing topic to discuss, because we need to understand Morgentaler, who he was, and how the Supreme Court worked. Now, Canadian abortion was essentially prohibited until I think 1983, maybe. It might have been later, but it was legalized essentially fully post 1982 when Pierre Trudeau, Freudian slip. Similar people though.
Well, they are both pro.
They are both liberals. But when Pierre Trudeau instituted the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, now we don't talk about how insanely liberalizing this document was. This was the imposition of an American-style constitution, but if the American-style constitution had been written by 20th century progressives, that's the difference here. So prior to the 1982 Charter, the Supreme Court and various provincial courts had struck down abortion many times. I think you could get it within very small exceptions with the permission from doctors, but it was essentially banned. Now, post 1982, we have this fellow called, I believe his name is Henry Morgentaler. I never remember his first name. Henry Morgentaler. So Henry Morgentaler was an abortionist born in Poland. And what he would do is he would move to anti-abortion provinces in Canada, and he would open abortion clinics, and he would perform abortions on Canadian women and children until the local police arrested him, and the local government and local provincial courts prosecuted him and found him guilty. And he actually spent quite a bit of time in prison for this. But what he would do every time following the kind of institution of the 1982 Charter is he would go to a province, open his practice to explicitly get arrested, and then appeal the decision all the way to the Supreme Court. And he did this every time. So he used the recently empowered American-style Supreme Court that we received in 1982 as a club with which to beat the particular provincial powers that we had in Canada. And through this fashion, he managed to get essentially unrestricted abortion within Canada. Now, the Supreme Court in Canada was used to impose top down a lot more kind of elite urban kind of bohemian values. Gay cohabitation was one of them. Pornography being more kind of normalized was another. There's many of these cases. The abolishment of the Sunday laws, so on and so forth. But in this particular fashion, we see that there was actually strong pushback in Canada, and there was a pretty strong rejection of these issues, because Canada at that point was like culturally conservative. You were not allowed to open a business on a Sunday within 4 decades ago. Like most of our parents and our kind of colleagues at work would remember a period in our lives where Canada didn't have business open on Sundays, which is a big deal. So I think it's important to understand Canada in that particular aspect and how strong the Supreme Court is and how little regulation of it is. Unlike the Americans, who have wisely determined that institutions wield power even if they're not elected, Canada has this weird tradition of respecting the institution and not trying to push back on it. Harper did and was brutally crushed. As a result, all of his attempts to curtail the voting rights of prisoners, for example, were really knocked down the Supreme Court. But I think if you are a Canadian conservative who is interested in affecting this country, then you really should be fighting for the courts, or you should be disempowering them. Now, one of the interesting things about the Canadian Charter of 1982, and one of the concessions Pierre Trudeau had to give to the provincial premiers when he was having them agree to this thing, was I think it's Section 33. 1 second, let me Google it. Yeah, Section 33, the notwithstanding clause. And what that essentially allowed to do was it gave the Canadian provinces a veto power. I would say is not totally the same as the American president, but it's I would say similar and perhaps more powerful, where they can ignore federal law and they can ignore decisions from the Supreme Court, with some exceptions regarding voting rights, so on and so forth. And that this power was what was supposed to allow the provinces to curtail the federal government and the Supreme Court, which is kind of viewed as a creature of the federal government, and allow them to govern themselves according to their own particular regional interests. Now, that isn't really used at all outside of Quebec, and that's one of the reasons why Quebec is so particular and unique, is because they actually use Section 33 to unconstitutionally, quote unquote, impose kind of linguistic restrictions upon Anglo-Canadian, like English-speaking Canadians in Quebec. They use something that violates the Constitution, but they use 33 to override that and maintain their own kind of provincial interests, which is how Canada is supposed to be operated. And I think if a conservative had a little bit of spine, they could follow through with that. If for example, the Premier of Alberta wanted to institute Albertan gun rights and open carry, that is something you could reasonably do with Section 33. Will that ever happen? Who knows? I'm not particularly familiar with the particular, like the specifics of Albertan provincial politics. But again, the structure of our country matters, and the complete institutional capture that the Liberals has a big effect. I think the average Canadian is not significantly more liberal than the average American, but by virtue of our elites selling us out to the American political order, then Canada, in its practical governance, is functionally a lot more liberal. But I think the tools are there that if someone was actually willing to do so, they could make Canada a lot more functionally conservative through kind of just a political majority in Parliament and the proper use of kind of Canada's levers of power.
That's something I noticed on.
Yeah, I mean, I think another important example of what you brought up is that Brian Mulroney almost banned abortion almost entirely in I think the 1980s, or maybe it was early 90s. But when Mulroney was prime minister, he almost banned abortion outright, and it just failed in the Senate by because it was a tie, and a tie in the Senate means it gets shot down. So I mean that that was not that long ago that Canada almost outlawed abortion completely. Now, I mean, that's politically completely unviable now. But yes, I do think it's very important to emphasize that a lot of this stuff is a lot more recent than we might think. Charles, was there something you were trying to say?
Yeah, sorry about that. Something I noticed on this go around of Lament is Grant was talking about all these institutions that existed at his time that like had conservative presence in them that weren't being supported at all. Like he mentioned Donald Creighton in the universities, and there were all kinds of other conservative intellectuals that were around at that time that just didn't get any support from the Conservative Party when it was in power. Same with the civil service, right? They weren't empowered. So he says there were conservative elements in there, and like I believe him, because a lot of them were older and had hung around when there were still ideas of Canada existing, but there was no effort to like take advantage of that or exert any control over the institutions. We kind of just gave them up. that would be one area where I'm not black-pilled, though. I think it's possible to take them back. It's just that's a multi-generational project, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go through a few the remaining super chats now, just quickly.
Pardon me, if I might add.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just I showed up late, so my apologies for that.
Yeah, no worries.
But I was just going to add that with regards to what we were talking about, the comparison of Canadian and American degrees of liberalization, one thing that Grant misses, and I think people maybe ought to think about more, is that like a lot of the changes that we see are down to like really mundane, sort of standard political processes. And the thing to remember is that both Canada and the United States have very significant regional divisions that play into these. So like in the United States, for example, statistically, whenever you look at like political opinions polls, religiosity, whatever, like any kind of social or political statistic, the South in the United States always sticks out as like being a very sort of, idiosyncratic region, right? It tends to be far more religious, far more conservative. If you were to take the South of the United States out of, American statistics, American politics, the United States would look much more like a Western European country like Canada, something like that. And a lot of the things that occur in the United States are often down to like this conflict of interest between various local political factions, right? And it's you get a similar story in Canada, where we were talking about Quebec, but I think one thing that people miss is that a lot of the liberalization that occurred was sort of determined by really sort of conflicts in Canada that go back to Confederation. So like in Quebec, for example, they adopted a model of nationhood that relied on the Quebec state and the territorial extent of the province of Quebec as a way of sort of undermining the power of what they saw as like the Anglo-Saxon hegemony over the sort of federal Canadian state. And I think Lament had mentioned this earlier, but there used to be a much more sort of civilizational focus on like French Catholicism as the nature of the identity that sort of most Quebecers or Lower Canadians prior to that felt. And the shift from, feeling like there was one continuous sort of identity of just every sort of French Catholic who lived in British North America to there being a specifically Quebec identity was something that was designed to allow for the process of modernization during the Silent Revolution. Just that Quebec adopted liberal values, industrialized, took control of a lot of its own affairs, and then used this sort of newfound independence and political power to push for increased powers against the federal government, which is, from their view, more Anglo-Saxon. And this was actually used, if you want to take an example of an issue, this was used in the change with Quebec's immigration policies, because now that they had a sort of more state-centered, territorial-focused notion, then their notion of how to grow the Quebec nation shifted from the traditional sort of focus on increasing the amount of children that sort of French-Canadian families were having, right? Traditionally in the 19th century and early 20th century, the Catholic Church in Quebec would encourage very strongly women to have lots of children. But post the shift in the way that they conceived of themselves, it became focused on the French language and sort of civic membership in the Quebec polity. And so this allowed them to shift their focus to importing people from various different French-speaking countries, usually Haiti or other ex-French colonies. And likewise in Canada, in Anglo-Canada, pardon me, the adoption of multiculturalism was largely down. And actually, you'll find this if you sort of read accounts from French Canadians on the development of multiculturalism in Canada. But it comes from this sort of attempt to undermine the notion that the French Canadians basically have a special status as like a founding nation of Canada, and rather just have French Canadians be like one of the many different nations in the multicultural project. Pardon me. And so this sort of served the function of strengthening the hand, I guess, that Elise and Ottawa had over the whole country. And sort of this back and forth was actually what facilitated a lot of political change. And of course, the other thing is that, I believe Ryan brought up the the restriction on business on Sundays up until fairly recently. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of sort of political forms were left over from prior periods when people had different social attitudes. But by the time that they were repealed, they didn't really mean the same thing. So you see actually the development of, some early signs of a fairly strong liberal tendency in the modern sense in Canada, even in the 1960s, when the origin of our hate speech laws actually comes from a parliamentary committee dedicated to countering what they called hate propaganda. And I believe the commission who recommended it was called the Cohen Commission. And it was named after the sort of head of the commission. And they were the first ones to recommend that Canada sort of have restrictions on expression. The point was to stop again what they called hate propaganda. So I think the story is sort of like a bit more complicated, just in the sense it's down to like a lot of specific actions by various sort of actors. And I think Grant's sort of focus on trying to take the view that America acts as like a hegemonic unity or like an institution sort of doesn't do justice, I think, to the complexity of the process.
What was it that he called it? He called it the American Empire's little brother, I think, several times.
I believe so, yeah.
Yes, that's very interesting.
I most certainly would characterize it as a not a client, but like a satellite state in that sense, specifically in the economic and military sense.
I mean, that would be a totally fair characterization, to be honest. I think Canada operates under the umbrella of American imperium right now. We import a lot of American culture. Our kind of economic access to the global markets is contingent upon American naval control. The Americans explicitly sent political operatives to assist, I believe it was Pearson, in the defeat of John Diefenbaker. Like, there has been a very active kind of domination of Canada. It's just not an explicit one. So yeah, I think it's totally fair to conceive of Canada as a client of American empire. Do I like that? Certainly not. That's awful. I'd rather that not happen. And a lot of the kind of political and geopolitical theorizing I do is how do we as Canada ensure that we can have autonomy and control without getting like curb stomped either by American kind of economic coercion or by American political coercion. Because options like aligning with Russia and China are just not on the table if you don't want to get assassinated or removed from office.
And then geographically speaking, you also have to ask yourself, is it even possible? Is that even a viable, is there even a viable possibility that you can kind of break free from underneath America's influence?
I would point to history, and I think it's important to conceive. So Canada in its earliest days was largely French, but did manage to maintain pretty significant independence and a number of military victories over the Americans during things like the French-Indian War, despite having a fraction of the population. I think the population of Canada in, I think, the 1700s or so, prior to the full Anglo conquest, was something like 60 to 80,000 compared to some 30 million people living in the Americas. My dates might be wrong. I would have to go check my source. But yeah, during those periods, there was huge populational and economic differences, and the Canadians were able to kind of maintain advantage by having a particular familiarity with the land and alliance with the natives. Is that possible now? Certainly not. The natives of the New World are by no means as strong or as martial as they were in that period. So the question then comes, well, how does Canada navigate the 21st century without being kind of totally assimilated into the kind of like liberalizing influence of the American empire? And I'm not like condemning the American people. This is a particular kind of Washington-esque ideology that is imposed upon the world. We can see this in things like American embassies in the Vatican or in Muslim countries flying gay flags. Like, this is the ideology of a particular group of people, but they happen to govern America.
Well, if I might add, what we consider to be sort of the tools of American empire in Canada, and the way that the Canada is run as sort of a client state of the United States, were actually applied by the American state on their own population in around the same period, being the mid to late 20th century. So I think I said earlier that the South is sort of like an outlier in a lot of ways. And of course, there was a lot of effort put into sort of like transforming the South and sort of other states that tended to be more conservative by the American federal state. There's various policies like school busing, although that was actually done in, even Boston or whatever. But, I think that it's worth remembering, right, that, in a geopolitical sense, Canada probably will, at least as long as America is sort of like a major player on the world stage, remain, tied to America strategically. But the degree of cultural attachment, I think, definitely varies. And again, like if you want to contrast it, I mean, some of the American states have done better, recently in sort of resisting the centralizing influence out of Washington. The states that use this opportunity from the Supreme Court to bring back their abortion laws is one case. And if we were to look at Canada as sort of like one element within the American empire, then I think Brian is right. There's a lot more that could be done by a Canadian state without having to do anything, very far-fetched in terms of just strategically. That, there's means at the disposal of the Canadian state that could be employed to protect the culture and, enact more conservative policies and this kind of thing. Obviously, degrees of independence is sort of another question.
And Grant touches on some of those. Like he mentions the creation of the CBC, and I don't think he mentions it, but the National Film Board too. Like those were both consciously designed to promote Canadian content and reduce the influence of the Americans. Of course, the difficulty now is that they're staffed by people educated in universities teaching American ideology and who grew up watching CNN and Fox News. So, but I think you're right. I think the Canadian state could definitely be doing more in that area, and that's another set of institutions that we should probably be trying to recapture, as opposed to if you're Maxime Bernier trying to get rid of them.
I do think one of the issues that people have when they discuss Canada, even on a political level, and talk about things like Canadian culture, and perhaps I will sound like a liberal in saying this, but I think when we're responding to the elite conception of Canada, and when we look at the elite conception of Canada, we look at what Trudeau is saying. Trudeau has explicitly said that Canada is a post-national state. Well, this is a response to the nation state that dominated the 19th and 20th centuries. I don't think that Canada is a nation state, and I think when people try to conceive of it that way, they run into a lot of internal contradictions that they're maybe not aware of. So when we say Canadian culture, well, what are we talking about? That's a very kind of easy question to have. Now, I don't mean to say that Canada doesn't exist because it is made of constituent parts, but I'm saying rather Canada exists because it is made of constituent parts. You can't have a car unless you have engines and wheels. It's a similar thing with Canada. And I think if you were going to talk about having the federal government explicitly promote Canadian content, there's a lot of issues with that, because instead of having an organic culture and an organic identity that arises from a combination of nation, history, and geography, heritage and geography, like the kind of intersection of those two, which produce kind of unique nation. And again, we see in the New World that the New World has transformed people into new nations. I would say the Maritimes are very distinct and unique from kind of either the rest of Anglo-Canada or their heritage in Scotland. There is certainly things that harken back to it, and they take a lot from where they came from, but they're their own thing. Similar like Appalachia in America, I would say that's its own ethnos, its own nation. Same thing with Newfoundland, the Quebecois, the Pléons, the Acadiens. These things are all nations that have formed in the New World. So when we talk about culture and promoting it through the federal lens, it's like, okay, well, what are we promoting? And beyond that, it's like we have now removed the incentive of organic culture that I think a lot of us as right-wingers really do believe in, is that you can't fake culture. It comes across as kitsch, as fake, as cheap. And this is why I think a lot of what the kind of contemporary culture makers are doing now it feels so hollow to a lot of people, and why they're having such a hard time with it is there's no longer that kind of that heartland, that periphery that still has a degree of asabiya on which to draw. They're just rehashing nonsense because there's so little left to kind of draw from the well. So there's actually a debate within kind of the Canadian publishing sphere, and I've been kind of going around and bothering all the old bookstore owners and like antique book dealers of Canada in pursuit of our book. But there's a bit of a debate on whether or not Canada should even have publicly funded and dictated culture and arts. I don't necessarily agree with their position. I think places like Austria have shown the value that you can have from elite and state patronage towards the arts, but I think that Canada's way of approaching it currently is wrong. That doesn't mean we need to abolish the CBC, but again, we need to understand Canada as it is and according to its particularities and unique qualities, and move forward according to that. It's like I don't think that the erasure of the particular groups in Canada is ideal or desirable, and I think their promotion is kind of good. But again, like when you promote one thing, you don't promote another. So you have this huge calculus of what you're doing with these institutions. But again, you have to capture these institutions first before that even becomes a question.
I would also add that I think Grant is a bit too much of an economic determinist, a technological determinist, in the way that he reads the political change. Now, granted, he was right that Canada developed into this like very liberal sort of American vassal state, but I think that actually has more to do with Canada being sort of a member of the Western world generally, and then a member of the Anglo-Saxon world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that as well.
Yeah, like really, you could sort of see this trend, in just the thought of the progressives by the 1930s. The fact that in the Anglo-Saxon countries, I know England and the United States a little bit better, like by the 30s, like a lot of the elites were like just full out communists. This obviously shifts over time, but the fact that people in Harvard and Yale and Oxford and whatnot are sort of all approaching what we modern liberalism right over time. I wouldn't really put that down to like American economic dominion. Like I think that I mean there's definitely questions of like national sovereignty and wanting to sort of control your own resources and this kind of thing. But the degree to which, for example, the dissolution of the family structure through law, right, not through economic means, but just through courts, children's courts, laws sort of restricting the father's power over his own sort of family, the sort of implementation of more liberal values in media, at schools, this kind of thing. I don't really see that as stemming necessarily from any particular economic arrangement. That's a conscious choice by sort of policymakers, and you can find the specific people who wrote these specific laws, as known historical figures. So I think it really just comes down to more like this is what the people who had control of the levers of power at the time wanted as a development. You can read the early American sort of progressives in education. John Dewey talks about forming like a new citizen and this kind of thing. Like, so there's a lot more intentionality, I think, than determined economic development. And then just to add to, as like a small point to Ryan's point about patronage, I think this again is more of just a human question. Like if you look at the Renaissance, right, in terms of its art, which is sort of recognized as being some of the great art of humanity, it was often done in the name of like state patronage by princes and lords and this kind of thing. I mean, it really comes down to you need patrons who have good taste, and then you need them to be hiring people who are skilled. And then, of course, in terms of the ideological element, you'd want people who sort of have good, generally moral beliefs or like philosophical, political beliefs. So, in the case where the Canadian state is the patron of Canadian arts and letters, you have a patron who is a sort of cosmopolitan liberal. They're very tasteless people, like the average Canadian politician and bureaucrat. They're not very refined or sophisticated. So they just lack good artistic taste. And they hire people who are frankly mediocre to do the work. And, the people who get federal government funding are simply often not talented. And so that produces, well, bad product. And I think it's pretty much just that, simply.
We did used to have private patrons of the arts too in the Laurentian elites, but the institution of the Laurentian elite in general is kind of deprecated. Like Vincent Massey used to commission the Group of Seven. I think they did a portrait of him or something like that. But yeah, I don't know like who in this country could actually be a patron for the
Well,
arts.
I think this
That
is
wouldn't
one of
suck.
the main challenges of kind of constructing or changing a political order meaningfully going forwards. Is I think we've seen a lot of success with the American populists and the European populists, and I think we discussed this yesterday in the kind of middle class nationalism thing. But there are you cannot just be right wing. You need to understand how your particular like theater operates, the history of it, how it works, all the kind of nuts and bolts that require you to get a little bit dirty and to do some actual research. And then you need to understand what your kind of foundational goals are. Why are you engaged in politics? Is it be like the most based and to like impress all your friends with how epic and based you are? It's like cool, you will just lose. That this is not, you don't operate politics on aesthetics. Aesthetics proceed from a particular people and a particular kind of form of living.
I mean, according to like left wing YouTube, anybody who isn't left wing is right wing. So
I mean, yes, but again, like I don't think that's an improper definition. I think the conservative movement, as it stands, is exclusively compromised or comprised of those who are not left wing, which is why there's so much infighting on the right, because a lot of us do not agree with each other and probably never will. I think most of us here would agree that we are not libertarians in the sense of the American Federal Political Party, but that party is theoretically right wing. Things like this. But in regards to our kind of fundamental goals with politics, well, we want to create a country that is like healthy, wealthy, and safe for our children and our like the future progeny we have. That's the whole point of politics, at least in my opinion. We want to create a nation that is conducive to virtue, that will last the test of the ages, that will not kind of submit to the errors that are so common in Rudyard Kipling's kind of the gods of the copybook heading, so on and so forth. And it's how do you get there? Well, you need elites. We as right wingers, as conservatives, believe in hierarchy. We believe that it is natural and good. We believe that there are some who should lead and some who should follow, and that is virtuous to understand your station and adhere to it. We believe in, at least we understand the importance of institutions, the necessity of either building them to concentrate capital, to concentrate talent and human numbers to the employment of a particular political end, or to contest the institutions that exist and gain control of them once again. We remember with the failure of Borden and the conscription crisis, how the Liberals managed to capture all of Canada's important political institutions, and in the absence of a political institution, built new ones to kind of maintain their hegemony for the next majority of the 20th century. So yes, we these are basic things, and the question then becomes, how do we get there? Do we continue to theorize and complain on Twitter, or are there practical options moving forward? And I think there certainly are, and I think there are many reasons to be not only hopeful but actively optimistic in the future of Canadian politics, which is again why a lot of us have an issue with Grant's Lament. Is I think Grant's analysis, his kind of doctor's conclusion regarding the health of the state in which most of us live was certainly accurate. It was wonderful. It was prescient, and he is a political and philosophical genius, in my opinion. But I do think there's a future of Canada that is waiting right there to be kind of pushed for, and that's what we'll see in the 21st century. Is can Canada assert itself, or are we going to continue to be an open air supermarket, a post-national state where the state is just the kind of governor of this kind of nebulous bohemian space that people just exchange goods in and have no meaningful connection to the land or to the history, and just move to different nations as the GDP and as the economic convenience kind of demands. So I think that's the great struggle of the 21st century, and that's why it's exciting to live now. It's like this is like history is now. Like we are the times. It's not just a kind of a rear guard. It is it is an exciting period to live in. Sorry for the excessive monologuing.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I would like to get to some super chats though quickly. No message, but Miss Jess Horst for $20. Thank you very much for the generous super chat. And then we did that one already. Pete Budapest for another $10. This would appear, it would appear to me that Canada, like the G7 nations, proudly marches under the United Rainbow flag of the GAE, often to the detriment of its own interests. I don't see any desire to break free. Is there anything I would like to say to that?
I mean, as a quick point, I think Ryan already brought up the anti-immigration stances, but is it, there is the same building blocks, let's say, that other populist movements have used in other Western countries that exists among Canadian people. I mean, the whole trucker thing is just like one manifestation of, the fact that a lot of people in the country are still willing to sort of stand up for what they consider to be their inherited liberties and this kind of thing. The issue in Canada, I think, is more in terms of expressing, sort of formalizing and channeling these sentiments. I mean, this is just a practical question. But no, I would not say that, people in Canada simply lack the will to stand up for their own interests.
Yeah, no, I mean the lack of any existing organization is definitely a big issue when it comes to this, because I had not heard previously that Canada is more anti-immigration than the United States. That's interesting. I certainly have been familiar with public opinion polls and stuff that demonstrate that there's a very large amount of Canadians that are, and certainly just from sort of conversations with normies, I've found that often seems to be the case. But there's just no political institution in Canada that is pushing for that at all. The Conservatives have never really been anti-immigration, or not, at least not for a very long time. So yeah, I don't want to ramble too much on that. Another super chat for $10. The slow march of the institutions may not work for the right wing right now, but I work in the government, and simply gumming up the system is a valuable holding action while we prepare for our counter. I don't really know what that means, to be honest. So I have no idea what to say to that. But thank you for the money. But yeah, I mean, if anyone would like to respond to that last
sorry,
question,
yes.
feel
So
free, or...
what he's actually referencing a theory by, I believe it's Gramsci, the Long March of the Institutions.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, I know the long
so
march to institutions is. I just
the
didn't
kind
really
of the
understand
common
what they meant
rebuttal
by
I
gumming up
hear
the
a lot
works.
from people is that we should do the Long March to the Institutions, which is what the Liberals did. And I think Donoso references earlier when he said that a lot of the kind of intellectual elites of the West became communist in the 20th century. Yes,
Yeah, I just don't see how
completely
viable
correct.
that is personally for us.
Not viable. If you have the insane sociopathy capable of just tolerating liberals in any capacity, you are either a liberal or are insane. I think what Orban did is probably a much better model than that one, wherein he built his own institutions and supported them explicitly. We saw Diefenbaker fail to do this, and this is why I criticized Diefenbaker, is that Diefenbaker had access to existing institutions and existing intellectuals that he didn't capitalize on at all. This is something that conservatives and right-wing people should correct going forward. It's something that Orban has done in Hungary. He's built his own conservative universities. He has complete institutional control of the broadcasting apparatus. These kinds of things are very important to do and should certainly be done. But I don't think the Long March to the Institutions is the way to go. Now, your audience member is not suggesting that. He is saying that you can kind of be a spoiler in the system of bureaucracy, which I certainly will not advocate for. But kind of do as you will. But yes, it's definitely a prescient observation, I think.
On the political point as well, I think actually the notion of a long march to the institutions is way too overstated on the right as an explanation for what happened in the 20th century.
It's basically become like a Sargon meme at this point.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually don't I'm pretty sure that the sort of notion that exists now on the right of institutional takeover comes from Moldbug. And if I recall correctly, it's sort of the notion that, well, how do you explain progressive change? It's not, it's not sort of the directed action of some specific group of people you can point at or some specific person, because you've used that as too conspiratorial. Rather, you want an explanation that more looks at it like an undirected sort of general process, decentralized, right? Which actually kind of makes sense if you're into computer programming, I suppose. That's sort of the way they look at it in terms of networks and this kind of thing. But I think just factually, if you look at for example, the liberalization of corporations and the fact that corporations now, during Pride Month, for example, will be putting out lots of essentially propaganda for the state's cultural goals. This traces its way back to
No,
civil
you
rights
even
law.
see it on Fox News now. Like there was like a commercial, it was like Fox News celebrates Pride. Take a look
Well,
at
yeah,
the first
exactly.
openly gay Republican gubernatorial candidate in like South Carolina or whatever. I thought it was the funniest thing.
I mean, even worse, there was a couple weeks ago that segment they did where they were promoting a quote unquote trans kid.
Yeah.
Well, Fox News going that far? Wow, ballsy.
Yeah, no, I mean there was there was outrage from all the sort of like Daily Wire crowd and stuff like that. But as far as I can tell, they have not apologized or anything.
I mean, Daily Wire crowd, they're not that far behind at this point.
Daily Wire today was promoting gay parenting and adoption.
Yeah, I
so.
saw that. I mean, I have not watched the video, so I don't want to comment on things.
I will defend the Daily Wire crowd because I just I mean, in my observation, right, like I have a few friends who tend to be like sort of conservative leaning evangelicals. The people who watch Daily Wire are actually pretty good. Like they'll be pretty good on the issues if you talk to them. They're actually pretty easy to convince on the stuff that maybe they're not aware of. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I think Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh aren't that bad. They're very socially conservative.
I think Michael Knowles can be pretty cringe. I'm sorry.
I mean, I'm not
his 1984 thing with Dave Rubin was really cringe.
I haven't seen that, so I can't really comment. But no, I mean, I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm just saying by the standards of like mainstream conservatives. I don't want to talk about Americans on Dominion Day.
Let's talk about Canadian boomercons. JJ McCullough, guys.
He's terrible and not representative of.
No, never say that name again.
I will personally, if I ever am given a sliver of power in this country, I will personally go to JJ McCullough's house and deport him to Alaska. Like, get the fuck! I hate JJ McCullough so much. Every time he runs his idiot mouth and gives his dumb Republican opinions in this country, it boils my gourd. I want to write an article about it because it actually he's so wrong on every single occasion. It's amazing how wrong he is. Like it's a mythical force. This guy just like opens his mouth and it's just wrong and a bad take. It's like, how do you achieve this? Like, you are doing this deliberately. It's like an act of masochism. It's like David French tier. Sorry for the
reviewing some of his videos might be a good idea for a future live stream.
That would be funny. I did just want to quickly make the point about the institutions. Like the sort of liberalization of corporations, for example, comes from U.S. civil rights law. Essentially, you can get sued if you can't demonstrate in a court that you are actively working to make your workplace tolerant and inclusive. And so what this means is that in order to preempt random lawsuits from disgruntled employees, corporations need to hire HR managers who have training in like diversity or whatever, and hold the diversity training sessions and all this stuff, so that when they get taken to court, they can say, no, we did, X, Y, and Z events last year. So we're fulfilling our requirements under, I think it's called Title IX. And therefore, right. And so when you hire all these people to fulfill that, then the people running the corporation are going to be these liberal people you're hiring. And then they're going to hire other liberal people and so on and so forth. And you get what we have now. Right. The fact is that, and I think there's a book, Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, who sort of covers this. But the fact is that really, if you go back to the origins of this, it's like a small group of like powerful political actors, basically. I think, for example, the Kennedy, I know John F. Kennedy, I think, was like part of this sort of push for more liberal social application of policies in the state. But another motivation was the Cold War, and the United States wanted to demonstrate to sort of the world countries that it actually wasn't, let's say, a backwards, intolerant nation. This was particularly important in the conflict with the Soviet Union over Africa. I think there's actually specific sort of historical reasons and specific actions by specific historical actors that account for way more of this change than sort of like a long march through the institutions sort of narrative, basically.
You stunned me with your brilliance. The distributist for $5. Cheers. Thank you very much, Dave. So yes. Sorry. Very, very good points. I'm sure I just don't know what to say. Don't really have anything in response to that. But yes. So does anyone have anything else they'd like to talk about? We haven't really gone through.
Okay,
much.
so
I mean, are there any particular points anyone has from Lament for a Nation they wanted to discuss?
not a particular point per se. However, I do feel like an interesting subject of discussion would be the difference between, or at least how it all shifted, the type of nationalism that has existed in Canada, beginning with you had like like with the book comes from the perspective of a more right-wing nationalism, but then how all of a sudden nationalism in Canada is just all of a sudden left-wing, anti-everything American, and then that's like the definition. That's just all nationalism is now.
Yeah, I mean, so it's important to point out that right-wing anti-Americanism was not unique to Canada. It was, I believe, especially strong in Canada. But this was a very normal thing on the center right, and I mean more right-wing groups too. But even just for the center right in Europe, being anti-American was a very normal and expected thing. For similar reasons. I mean, the reason it was so extreme in Canada was because Canada, it has always and will always, at least as long as America continues to exist, Canada will have to exist in the shadow of America.
Yeah.
So it's not a surprise why it was a particularly poignant force in Canada. But yeah. So right-wing anti-Americanism, including center-right anti-Americanism, has always been a thing. But I mean, I think the obvious answer, the reason why it went away, was the Cold War was a major factor, where it just for normal right-wingers, for very understandable reasons, became much more concerned with the Soviet Union than they were with the United States. And it seemed like a zero-sum game. You had to choose one side, and they, for very reasonable reasons, chose the Americans. And it's something that I can't really fault anyone for. It's completely understandable why they would have done it. This is actually, again, I don't want to get too much into non-Canadian stuff, but this is something that I think has harmed the Catholic Church in certain ways, in particular subverting the Church's teaching on economics. Where throughout the 20th century, all the popes really continued to publish encyclicals and teach issues on economics that are very solid and very much in line with Catholic social teaching. But that's not the impression that was created. The impression that was created from the time of Pius XI until John Paul II was that the Church is basically just on board with free market capitalism.
Especially, now. I think, with John Paul II too.
John Paul II definitely is the culmination of this. It definitely started before him, but it really reached its height with like JP2 hanging out with Ronald Reagan. And again, it's
like
not
people usually associate him with like Reagan and Thatcher. At least on an international political level.
No, it's common for like American evangelical boomer cons to like JP2 because he punched communism to death or something. But yeah, no, and I mean, to be clear, I love JP2. He's a saint. I'm not trying to unnecessarily criticize him. All I'm saying is like the stuff JP2 wrote on economics were fine. It wasn't just fine; it was great. But for most people, when they saw JP2 standing next to Reagan, that's all they really needed to hear. And the example I've cited before is this might be a bit of a frivolous example, but Ben Shapiro, I remember once saying on his show that Pope Francis reversed the Catholic Church's support for a free market capitalism under John Paul II, and now the Catholic Church supports socialism.
That's I don't even know how to respond.
Yeah, it's incredibly silly.
That is just very silly. Like I'm not even a Roman Catholic.
I don't know if he actually used the term free market capitalism. He definitely had support for capitalism. I don't think he used the qualifier free market.
Or maybe he just said free markets.
I think you said capitalism. I think it was without the qualifier free market. Because he was specifically contrasting capitalism to socialism. But yeah, no, it's again, I don't want to get into papal stuff too much here. Again, it's like the American stuff. It's a bit beside the point of today's stream. But I mean, I would say that the area that Pope Francis has been most conservative on is social teaching. His social teaching is very clearly in line with previous popes. But yeah, no, just my point is, I'm pretty sure that Ben Shapiro has not been reading the social encyclicals. I'm pretty sure he's never read Rerum Novarium or whatever that encyclical from Pius XI is. I can't speak Latin. I'm pretty sure Ben Shapiro doesn't know any of that. All Ben Shapiro knows is that Ronald Reagan and John Paul II stood next to each other, and that equals John Paul II endorsed capitalism. So the point I'm trying to make, sorry, that's a bit of a digression. But the point I was trying to make with that is that a lot of people on the right, and a lot of Christians in that case, allied with the United States against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was the bigger threat at the time. But what that had a lot of negative consequences downstream, including the sort of destruction of right-wing anti-Americanism, where today in Canada, the Conservatives tend to be very philo-American, and the only real anti-Americanism comes from the left. I've stunned you all with my brilliance.
I think it's also worth pointing out too, like part of the reason for the realignment, I think, is what Grant describes in that conservatives in America only have right to the title in a particular sense. What they're conserving is their own sort of liberalism that came from the revolution.
No, that's exactly why conservatism in the U.S. context developed the connotation that it did, especially in the later half of the 20th century. I think it was Barry Goldwater wrote in his book Conscience of a Conservative so it had no social connotation at all. He wrote the definition of conservatism: it is the conservation of liberalism. That was the original kind of like post-war definition of what conservatism was meant to be, arguing for classical liberalism based upon sort of Burkean argumentation, Burkean rhetoric, and then eventually it didn't develop the social connotation until the late 80s, early 90s, when all the evangelicals came in. But it was a purely secular political movement, much closer to what we'd see as like libertarianism today. Back in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even up to like late Reagan era.
For sure. So I would say like the realignment comes in because conservatives in Canada, buy into that, and they say, I forget where I was going, but basically, Grant mentions too, opposition to this came from the left because they believed that progressivism in the US was reactionary. And so you could be anti-reactionary by being even more progressive.
Then you got the progressive conservatives before they fell apart.
Yeah. So I'd say that's like a important factor, is that the epistemology shifted. What it meant to be conservative changed, and so that's kind of how the perception of America as conservative and Canada as progressive sort of shifted, and that's where what you were asking at the beginning, the Canadian nationalism becoming left wing, came from as well.
I don't know how much this has been discussed already, but I think another sort of important element is like geopolitical. Obviously, with the decline of the British Empire, the sort of guiding motive of, I mean, I guess it wouldn't be called Canadian nationalism, but sort of focus on Canadian identity as being, part of this British Empire isn't really there if the actual British Empire is no longer there. And so, as Canada geopolitically aligns to the United States, and I think the liberalism point is sort of prescient just because the political tradition in Canada, as with sort of the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world, is political liberalism. I do think, I guess what we call classical liberalism gets a bit of a bad rap because of the way it's used by like boomer conservatives, like Jordan Peterson or something like this. But classical liberalism in like 19th century England and the United States even was actually, pretty conservative. Even if you look at like what the American founding fathers came up with for a constitution, they restricted the franchise to, I believe, like landowning men. I know, there's various restrictions on it later. In Canada, I mean, even though Canada had a sort of Westminster parliamentary system, it had, very strict penal code, sort of religious laws. You can even find U.S. Supreme Court decisions, I think, even until the 50s, where they talk about how what the First Amendment protects is sort of like socially valuable speech, but things that are, I forget there's a word that I'm missing, but things that are essentially not a valuable intellectual contribution, or things that are sort of subversive to the social fabric, are actually not protected. And so the way that people understood sort of the meaning of their own, what we call liberalism now, is different. Because it's worth keeping in mind that like what we call liberalism is really sort of like a reconstruction that people came up with sort of like post World War II to justify the new global order. And so they read back into like Western history, this sort of like line of development, right? That, if you look closely at it, it's not so clear that like sort of the Roosevelt, progressive consensus, like post World War II, Bretton Woods kind of system, was actually like the natural development of like the liberalism that had existed even in the 19th century. And so, naturally Canada having this very similar political tradition, same language, all this stuff, basically just followed the same course as America and bought into it. And lacking the British identity, there wasn't any sort of counterpole.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I don't really have anything to add to that, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that any liberal from 150 years ago would be considered like an insane far right radical by modern standards. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it feels like there's sort of a lull in the conversation here.
I was
Are
about
we
to say
getting?
Ben Shapiro.
we're
I was about to
gonna-
say Ben Shapiro would be seen as like a leftist if they were like 1750.
This is a pretty
Okay,
consistent kind of
Charlemagne,
story.
you are banned from this channel.
I'm surprised someone with the name Charlemagne is opposed to the idea of a nation which exists to defend French Christian civilization on the North American continent.
But are we not in the middle of a new political turning? Like, isn't that the whole point? Like,
Could you
to me,
expand?
like historically, we see the paradigm of politics change, and what like words mean changes. So we see this with the Reconstruction or whatever transition, where the Democrats became the party of the North and the Republicans became the party of the South, which was not the case prior to the Civil War, for example. So these kind of political turnings happen not fairly often, but with regularity. And even in historical Europe, we see these turnings as well, between who supports the bourgeois or the landed middle class, so on and so forth. And I would argue that we are in the middle of another such political turning, where politics is forced to reorient around kind of modern necessities and modern kind of political realities, and cannot just remain as this kind of crystallized and static force. I think we should understand nations and states as living organisms, and those change over time. I think the politics of Pierre Poilievre, Aaron O'Toole, these kind of pseudo-Reaganite types that are really just irritated they have to address social issues at all. I think that is dying, and the American Republicans, I think by and large, have been routed by the kind of MAGA Republicans that have come in to replace them, the America First types that are increasingly dominating the party in the tradition of Donald Trump, that have really kind of put the final nail in the coffin of the kind of George Bush conservatives. They certainly still are around and have very strong influence in Washington, but I do think we're seeing a pretty strong political turning away from that 20th century form of politics today, where words mean different things now. Like I would say that populism was not synonymous with right-wing political belief until relatively recently. You could talk about like the original America First movement, so on and so forth, way back in the early 20th century. But I do think that we are seeing the reorientation of politics, and I don't know if populism is the kind of final destination, but what we are seeing is how political coalitions are changing. So the Republican base is now Hispanics and rural and middle class, like American whites, for example, which is a pretty distinct change from the past. It's a similar thing with Canada. We look at the Canadian electoral map in the 2021 election, for example. We see that Canada is very starkly divided between the rural and the urban. The Liberals are almost literally confined within the cities. That's the only place they win. They have no real strong footholds in rural Canada anymore, with some minor exceptions. And they can get away with it because there's so many ridings in the cities, and because the rural ridings are divided between the rest of Canada, parts of the Maritimes and Quebec, which the Conservatives are not really willing to contest. They could win if they were willing to contest them, I believe, at least. But yeah, I do think we're seeing a political turning, because you used to see the Liberals win and they would have a sea of red, and they would have parts of the rural and parts of the metropolitan. But now they're exclusively metropolitan, and they've oriented themselves exclusively around the interests of these particular group of urban Canadians. And it works for them, certainly, but they're seeing a decline in success, but so are the Conservatives. We saw with the convoy, Aaron O'Toole was immediately sacked, and there's a kind of implicit understanding now that if you're going to be a Conservative frontrunner in Canada, you need to be at least tangentially pro-convoy or sympathetic to the convoy, which is why Poilievre will probably end up beating out Jean Charest, at least in my opinion. So yeah, I think by and large we're in that political turning, and I think that language will be reoriented as a result. And we see the kind of myopia of modernity when we look back and we apply our modern understandings of political terms to an older form of that same politics, because there has been an evolution. Like being a liberal in the 1850s is very, very different than being a liberal in 2022. And I think we should be kind of cogent of that, because I think within particularly the online right, but kind of right-wing intellectualism in general, there is a tendency to draw kind of a genealogy of ideas from kind of the Enlightenment all the way to the modern trans thing. And I think that might be a little bit too broad a stretch, and I think we should really stray away from doing this. I think there is a tendency towards determinism and towards a kind of political, maybe not Machiavellianism, but nihilism, where we consign things to an almost inevitable series of events, which is, I guess, a Marxist view of the world almost. But I think we at least should understand that history is made by explicit decisions and explicit acts of will rather than mere economic systems. And I think in understanding that, I think it makes the future a lot more optimistic to perceive, because yes, there are people that oppose us who are making decisions that have consequences we don't like, but we can also make decisions and influence things the same way. We're not simply consigned to a liberal society because we live in a modern technological society instead of an agrarian one. I think that's probably a fallacious view.
I also don't mean to drag it on, Mr. Settler's Lament. So,
no, I'm happy to keep on going. I just didn't seem like anyone was really talking. Just sorry, quickly though, briefly in response to what Ryan had said. I mean, I certainly agree that in the West there's been a sort of political turn. That the Reaganite Thatcher stuff is just no longer popular, which is very encouraging. But I suppose the reason that doesn't get my hopes up is I really, it doesn't seem like that's affected Canada at all. Some years ago, back when the Trump stuff first started happening, I assumed it would. But I mean, what do we have now? We have Pierre Poilievre, who is in the same Reaganite mold as ever, even more so. His attempt to be like to try and demonstrate he's really conservative is just to double down on that. And then, even as the alternative for people who don't care about actually winning elections but want to try and influence the mainstream political system, is the PPC, who again, like, at least Bernier is good on certain issues, but still, ultimately, he's just a libertarian. And it just really, I know, things could change. I have no idea where we'll be 5 years from now, but it doesn't seem like today that that things have been really going in a positive direction. I mean, the only time I can remember in recent years, having in economic platform I was even remotely excited about in Canada was Aaron O'Toole's housing policy. And we're certainly moving a lot farther away from that with Pierre Poilievre now.
Did you hear about it? I think it was either today or yesterday, but the organizer of the trucker convoy was arrested.
I vaguely heard about that. I didn't really
respond to that. And yes, like our elites are judicious, arbitrary, clearly tyrannical. Like they're not operating under any kind of comportment of justice, and they're clearly like attacking their enemies.
I was actually shocked when I was seeing how much Trudeau could actually do. Like this is during and after. I was like, I mean, I know this term is thrown around very willy-nilly, like everyone calls everyone a fascist these days, but I think that's like the closest I've seen to like legitimate fascist policy, or not policies, but action by the government in a North American country since I've been alive.
It was an insane time, but I would say that I'm actually very optimistic with the Canadian political developments. If we look at 2021, we see that the Conservatives received more raw vote than the Liberals. Overall, I think they got 15 million compared to the Liberals or something of that order. It was a very impressive turnout, in my opinion, at least from the Conservatives. Now you can make the argument that if you combine the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens, then Canada would be like a permanent Liberal supermajority. I don't necessarily agree with that, to be honest. I think a lot of that is legacy Canadians that vote Liberal because it's kind of the party of leadership, the party of ruling, the default party of Canada. But I actually believe, having talked to one of my friends recently, that the stats bear out that Liberals, especially older Liberals, generally break Conservative instead of breaking to the NDP. So I would contest the conception that Canada is overbearingly left-wing politically. I do think the convoy, the increase in Conservative votes, developments like the all the stuff that Derek Sloan is doing in the PPC, they do show there is appetite for political change in Canada and more of a conservative movement.
I mean, I agree with that. I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that in basically every Western country for the past several decades, mass immigration, for example, has I think always been rejected. And if there was ever really a democratic issue, it would be. If it was ever like put up to a referendum, it would be rejected. So that's not my concern that like the people aren't on our side. Not I want to fall into
I see what you're saying.
What I'm saying is I haven't seen any like mainstream political developments that actually bringing this as a policy change. Yep. Even if it comes from like conservative figures that even don't win. It's I did that Twitter space with you a month or so ago about the Conservative Party leadership, and it's like even the tiny dissident leadership candidates who know they have no chance of winning, even they aren't willing to really be particularly conservative.
Yeah, there is a culture of political cowardice in this country, and it's disgusting, and it's real. I think there's a lot of comfort. There's no real need to win elections because they'll keep getting elected in their conservative ridings, and it's disgusting. But I think it can be changed. But I totally agree with you about the lack of meaningful and like exciting political change in this country. We'll say jokes about Doug Ford, but Doug Ford is not great either. I think he understands how power works and he employs it. Like when he reduced the size of Toronto City Council, he clearly sent a message of like, know where your bread is buttered. I have the capacity to take away your jobs and your treasure if you oppose me, to the kind of urbanite liberals that were trying to attack him in the early parts of his campaign. He understands how the game is played, but is he meaningfully conservative? No. Was Jason Kenney meaningfully conservative? I don't think so either. So this is like, if we want to see meaningful political change in the country, that requires like meaningful political action. I think I don't think this stuff is just going to happen for free. Canada's a lot smaller than the States, and we don't have the same kind of legacy of conservative inside groups that are willing to like fund young people. The Conservative Party in Canada like actively gatekeeps or like pushes out young people, and really provides no support outside of elections. It's very disappointing to see, but that's something that has to be kind of addressed if we're looking to see real political change. Is there has to be like actual mobilization, institutional like building, and action. If there's to be any differences, and I think it'd be pretty easy for a relatively knowledgeable young person to beat out some of these kind of conservative grifters that are just kind of bearing out a pension in a safe riding. But that remains to be seen. But I think the kind of the dissenting political parties, which would be like Derek Sloan's Ontario Party, Maxime Bernier's PPC, so on and so forth, have been very poorly run, in my opinion.
Hey, maybe the Shark Tank guy can save you.
No, I would rather not. But yeah, so like as things are, it's not great, but I think they can be better. But
If I might add,
building things. Go ahead.
it's just as a like meta context, let's say, for Grant's work, he was sort of living in a period right before postmodernism became like the dominant condition of Western life. You can see it in the way he talks, some of the assumptions. He's still sort of living in like the right at the tail end of modernism. The sort of belief in the development of industry and technology is sort of this unstoppable force, and the growth of the continental system, and et cetera, all this kind of stuff. But obviously, about like 10 years on, or just about from Lament, and actually, I think the postmodern condition, like the original sort of book that talks about this, was commissioned by the government of Quebec, I think, from Jean-François Lyotard. Need to look into it, but I think there is that Canadian connection there. But in any case, what defines politics, actually, I think we also talked about this on a Twitter space. It was around like a while ago anyway. But what defines politics now, because it is postmodernism, is, I would argue, sort of the development of a politics based on faith, though I'm not sure if faith is the right word. But you see a sort of rejection of a lot of the sort of rationalism and scientific approaches that characterize Western thought, down through like the first half of the 20th century and then beyond that. And the sort of characteristic rationalism that was applied to politics, developmentalism and economics, this kind of thing, is being replaced by essentially like what I think is apt to call like political cults, right? Like in the United States, I think if you boil it down, like the two sort of driving forces of politics are like the MAGA, like QAnon movement, and then their counterpart on the left is like the BLM, like LGBT movement. And these are not like the sort of historical Western political movements. Like they don't have purported like scientific theories of history, and like focus on the technical development of like the industrial process or something like this. That is in like the political manifestos of even like the Labor Party up until like the 60s. When people sort of engage in politics now, it's like, I mean, I know that this might sort of sound basic because it is, I think Boomer can sometimes talk about this, but it's true that politics now is tribal and it requires sort of acceptance of dogmas. I mean, at the George Floyd Memorial, people were like getting baptized and like doing prayers to like the mural image of George Floyd. Meanwhile, there's like, various like MAGA sort of QAnon personalities and sites promoting maybe like far-fetched, sort of somewhat outlandish theories about how they're actually winning, in the face of, various pieces of evidence. And I think as a collection, the trend is towards sort of this, I guess what George Sorrell would have called sort of like, this group action based on a collective myth, right? That drives people to action. And so just in terms of where I think the Western world is going and moving away from what it was for a long time, I think that really there is sort of like an open possibility of, establishing some sort of political force that really acts on zealous conviction, because I think that's what's going to determine the foreseeable future. And that to me is what the evidence in terms of people's social engagement and political engagement suggests. So I know, Lament, you were saying there isn't much evidence from political elites and sort of major political developments that things are going to improve, but I think that's probably not necessarily the place to look, because like Ryan was saying, I think these are sort of remnants of an older system that in some sense is bygone, and sort of the notion of technocracy, I think, doesn't really or won't really hold sway, won't sort of stand up to the scrutiny of the 21st century and its conflicts.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I don't know if I have much to add. I feel like now is more or less an appropriate time to wrap up. Are there any closing thoughts?
Not really. Except if JJ McCullough watches this video and he ends up making a response to it, which I know he 100% will after he watches this. Be polite, like a Canadian should.
I hate you, JJ. You suck.
Does JJ
Yeah,
McCullough
my
normally
apologies
do?
for swearing on your podcast.
No worries. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
JJ McCullough
does
has a
JJ McCullough
patron.
often do response videos to niche live streams?
I don't know. I don't watch.
He had a back and forth with a small Quebec channel for a while.
Well, that's a
Okay.
Quebec channel. I mean,
Based Quebec, once again carrying the West.
It was a liberal, but yeah.
I mean, I think everything that he says is so very clearly wrong that it's not difficult to rebuke a lot of what he says. I just don't really think that it's worth it. I will say I think he actually does have quite a bit of influence with public-facing conservative
he
thought.
writes op-eds for the Wall Street Journal too, I think.
Well, yeah. I think he was the one who invented the whole gay conservative thing in Canada, though. That's been my.
Yeah, I think he wrote an article and this sort of propelled the policy.
It was
change
National Review or something of that nature, but yeah, he's a big proponent of that, and I draw a direct line from JJ McCullough to Aaron O'Toole wearing high heels, kind of walking around in the main street. So
that's fair.
Yes,
True
but I don't
intellectual
want to
lineage.
kind of draw the episode out more than it needs to be. So all I'd like to conclude with is don't at all despair about the future of Canada. The future of Canada is very bright. As long as kind of the heartbeats of a single Canadian, Canada will exist. And I think if we want to see change, if you, the listener, want to see change, then you should actually get involved. You should act.
They're also bringing Caillou back, so there's that.
Let's go.
But yeah, I think don't despair and take action in whatever way you feel appropriate. But yeah, thank you very much, Lament, for having us on.
Yeah, no worries. And did you guys want to shill the Canadian Journal again for anyone that wasn't around for when you did at the beginning?
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to find the microphone. Yes. So for those of you interested in the Canadian Journal, and we're always looking to host any articles or kind of pieces on Canada, anything you want to talk about, we're willing to kind of give a platform to on the Journal. You can find us at thecanadianjournal.com or on Twitter at Journal Canada. You can email me at contact at thecanadianjournal.com, and I will respond to you within 24 hours. Kind of beyond that, we are working on an anthology of Canadian kind of independent works. That's kind of the general theme is love letters to Canada, because we want to give people a reason to love their country and to really have belief and hope in it and belief and hope in the future, because we think that it's something that is worth loving and worth defending, and that's why we kind of go out and do what we do. So if anyone would like to contribute, you're welcome to kind of put something together and send it to us. The deadline is July 31st for kind of rough drafts. But yeah, thank you very much.
All right, and my channel is The Politicrat. I'm pretty sure Settler ended up putting a link to my channel in the show note. Haven't been as active as I would have liked since I went back to finish my education starting about a year ago, but I'm still trying to do some consistent uploads. I'm having a couple live streams here this next week. Talk about politics, economics, geopolitics, culture, literature, history, especially religion, mythology. It's just a whole broad range of subjects. But I do have a couple videos that will be coming out here in the next couple of months. Again, a couple live streams within the next few days. Come hit subscribe, check me out. I'm gonna have Settler on again one of these days, but I have no idea when yet.
But I don't know if I've ever been on your channel previously.
No, you were gonna come on for something last year with John David Ebert. It was like it was on classical and no, it was like the philosophy of late antiquity. I know we were going to talk about like Augustine, but you had to bail out.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. For that. But
no,
yes.
Fun.
Yeah. Yes. Subscribe to your channel. Subscribe to Politicrat's channel. And I'm pretty sure Charles and Cavalier, neither of you guys, for the audience, they're just Twitter randos. But I don't think either of you have anything you want to shill. If you do, feel free. If you have any prayer requests, you can feel free to give that.
Yeah, definitely. Pray for some private intentions of mine. It's a bit of a transitional year for me. I have a lot of stuff going on. I'm getting married and starting law school. So,
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
A bit fed to mention on the stream, but whatever.
I didn't say which law school.
We love our feds.
I haven't. Oh yeah. So yeah, just pray for me in general, I guess.
Okay. Well, Cavalier, anything you want to say?
I don't know. Pray for the Archdiocese of St. John's right now because they're just getting the results of having to sell off all of their churches. And hoping that will be it. Have you not heard about this?
They're selling all of their churches.
Well, a good number of them, as many as are being bought.
Okay. Why? Sorry, I'll ask you about this a different time. This probably doesn't need to be
discussed. We can talk about that later. Yeah.
Yes. No. Pray for that. That's very strange. I have not heard about that. Thank you everyone for watching. Pray for me. Do check out the Canadian Journal. It's really great. I really would highly recommend them. Subscribe to my channel. I really hope that I will do regular content. I really want to do weekly content, or even bi-weekly content would be an improvement from where I've been at recently. So I hope I'll do that. I was working on a video the other day. And I know this will get terrible views, so I should do something with Dave or something that I know will get good views. It's just I have to do something for Dominion Day. I can't, it's mandatory. But I know it's not really good view content. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for the super chats and stuff. And yeah, have a good day, everyone, and pray for Canada. That's an important prayer request.
Happy Dominion/Canada Day to all you guys, and then happy Independence Day, American listeners in 3 days. So
yeah, that reminds me. I'm very anti-American and everything, but y'all better cut the anti-American crap on the 4th of July. I have no toleration for that. That's just rude. Peace, everyone.
National